introduction for a discussion, and also for, as Joy just pointed out, for the work we might be doing over the next few months. What I'm planning to do in the next half an hour or so is starting with some level of generality, which may be far too general for some of you, but since I know we are a diverse audience, I thought I should start from there, in just trying to re-explain a little bit about what the structure of water law generally is. And we need that because without understanding some of the complexities of what water law is today in this country, we can't really go further. Then look at what water conflicts in the legal framework are very briefly. Look at some of the solutions that are proposed, basically the solutions of water sector reforms and as translated into water law reforms today, and then try to look beyond and maybe give some suggestions for the discussion we may have now and in the next sessions. Now, first of all, water law, that's an extremely broad topic because water is a substance of life and covers all the dimension of human existence, economic development, and so on. But in practice, water law, as it has developed, has been largely based and influenced by the notion of water as an input for economic development. And that's best reflected in the irrigation legislation, irrigation acts that we've had over the past 150 years or so, which seek to deal with water from the point of view of an input for economic gain. That was the aim of the first colonizers' legislation. Since the mode hasn't really changed over time, we are still stuck in that framework. Secondly, there is a strong link between water law and land ownership, which is nothing obvious in itself. It just so happens that over time, water law has developed significantly around principles related to land ownership, and that's because a certain number of principles, those common law principles that were also introduced from outside into the country, make direct links between land and access to or control over water. But as a result, land ownership has become a primary determinant in access and control over water in many situations, even though the general principle is that water is not owned by anyone and that the state is a trustee, a guardian, or a sovereign power, depending on the context we look at. Thirdly, and that's one of the levels at which the conflict issue immediately arises, water law has developed sectorally. We still don't have a framework water law, and as a result we have, I've simplified it into, I'm sure there are many more categories we could have. One, we have different laws according to the different users of water. So for instance, we have specific irrigation acts, we have specific acts concerning groundwater. Drinking water is considered separately, though not in any legislation. And we also have different rules and principles that apply to, for instance, to surface and to groundwater, even though from a scientific perspective we know today that this doesn't make sense. These are legacies of many, many decades of development of water law that hasn't yet managed to shed the old principle or the old understanding. Finally, one very important thing that I'll get back to later on is the fact that while, or maybe because of the sectoral nature of water law, not all sectors have been covered because laws have been adopted as and when the need was felt for political reasons, for economic reasons, for a certain number of reasons. As a result, for instance, drinking water, which by any standards in principle would be the most important part of water law, is one of the sectors that is not covered at all in legislation. In a sense, there is a whole policy framework, there are regulations at the local level, but in terms of framework legislation, in the sense if we have an irrigation act, we don't have any drinking water legislation either at the state or central level. There are some bits and pieces here and there, but there is no framework drinking water legislation. Now, another aspect of the basic structure of water law is the fact that we have a multiplicity of rules and principles that govern different users of water, different bodies of water at the same time. And that's one of the levels at which we get significant scope for conflicts
conflicts of different type, legal conflicts, practical conflicts, because many of these rules and principles have never been put together or were never thought together as a general framework. So for instance, okay, we have constitutional principles, we have legislation both in the states and at the central level when the center has decided that either if the constitution allows or like in the case of the Water Act, if the center decided it could muster the political will to take action. We have lots of common law principles, again the one that largely focus on access to water through land, as well as customary rules, as Manny just mentioned. Typically, okay, just to give one example, the customary rules are valid and they function at the local level, but when it comes to, for instance, all the new legislation we have with water law reforms currently, many of these customary rules and principles are just extinguished because they're not considered in the drafting process, and because they're not part of the formal legal system, they just are not considered. And whatever new formal rules come into being, assuming they're implemented at the local level, which is another issue, would just prevail over any existing rules because these rules have not been considered. So that's one of the levels at which there is significant scope for conflict. One last aspect I wanted to highlight in terms of the basic structure of water law is the role of the courts in developing water